Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for your trust and your time and your presence. I would like to begin with just a brief minute-long practice of gathering our awareness and attention so that we're in at least light ritual awareness, and then offer a prayer, and then we'll take it from there. And the 90 minutes, we might go a little bit over if there's time for conversation, will be a mixture of Q&A time, me teaching, and two different experiential practices for 10, 12 minutes. And the prayer, you may notice that the language is Yoruba. I happen to be an initiate, and as Aaron said, in West African Orisha tradition, in the lineage of Aluo Falalo Adesanya Wargade. And so when there's a white guy praying in Yoruba, it's good to have context for that. So let me invite you, if you would, to just drop your awareness into your heart, belly, and hips and feet, to be present in your body. Just inhabit your space. It's easy to get a little off center with all the computer time. And from that place, so just dropping your energy in a bit, notice if there's at least one power, ancestor, supportive force, God directly, that you feel in relationship with, that you can invite to be present with you. And from that place of being rooted in your body and a bit resourced, ask that there be a little bit of clearing or cleansing of your immediate space from anything you don't need to be holding right just now. And once that's happened, let there be a little bit of a boundary of protection and containment around your space. From that place of being rooted in your body, resourced and clear in your energy and protected, join me of setting intent with the prayer. Iba Lodumare Obatede Dekaye, Iba Rumila Barag Benerdiguna Bikeja Lodumare, Iba Wani Yami Yoshoranga, Yana Yagbalo Kiki Ruffin Juaye, Iba Eshu Eshulalo, Iba Onile Bodora Leo Geriafakoyeri, Iba Ririno Ateteniran, Iba Awani Rumole, Iba Wonorisha, Iba Amo Agba Lagba mi, Nebula Serunatiaye, Iba Oremi Bayo Komalafe ti Ebiwan, from Bogboy Rail from Ebiwan, from Bogboy Rail from Owolabi William Copeland ati Ebiwan, ati Bogbo Oluko Nibi ni Isheyi, Rogabo Isheyi, Rogabo Wanenia Nibi ati Ebiwan. Ambosio Siodoyin, Ambi Andrew Jawoy Dahon, Ramandobo Lati Badun Ayeyi, Adupe, Hashem. Thanks to the powers that support me, my ancestors, the ancestors of folks here, and those who would listen in later. Help there to be a blessing for Bayo and his family, and also for Owolabi William and his family, and all the other organizers and presenters, Aaron, Marie, everybody involved here, Karen, and help this time to be generative, and for me to be a good teacher, and for people to take what's good for their life and leave the rest. Give thanks to the good earth here in Western North Carolina, traditional Cherokee, Tsalagi lands, and for the copper and fire and metal and powers that allow for this kind of interaction to occur. We also extend solidarity and protection and transformative catalytic healing for the work for racial justice and change in the United States at the moment and beyond, and all those in solidarity with the work here and in other places. Thank you. Ashe. So, good morning from here. Let me situate myself a little bit because I feel like that's good form, and most of you don't know me. So my name's Daniel Foor, and I'm a husband, a dad, a teacher. I'm a doctor of psychology. I'm a ritual person. I've been steeped in ritual and spirituality as a calling and interest since I was pretty young. And my ancestors are English, German, and Irish, early settler colonialists to North America by way of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and now Western North Carolina. And my public work is more largely rooted in reintroducing an animist or relational framework where it's been lost. And within that, there is a specialization that, it's our 2-year-old upstairs. Within that, I didn't seek it out, but I've ended up having a specialization in work with the ancestors. And so we'll talk a bit about that, but also the bigger context of climate change and pandemics and racism and all the things that are stirred in the collective right now. So what's animism? That's a real technical way to refer to a way of seeing the world that recognizes that living humans are just one kind of person. There are lots of other kinds of people. Some of the ancestors are people, the stones, the plants, the deities, the stars, the microbes. They're unicorns, all like beings that we wouldn't think of as technically people. Corporations are people. Sorry, I think corporations should be reeled in, but from an animist framework, they're really problematic, incalcitrant, demanding little people. And so the framework of animism says that we're in a relational universe. Credit here to Graham Harvey, as a British pagan scholar and a lovely person, for being one voice that's dusting off the colonialist legacy of the word animism in a way that's much more in dialogue with contemporary indigenous people. So credit to his intellectual lineage through Irving Hollowell and Ojibwe people. And the the ethic of relationship is not new to any given ancestral group on Earth or people. So I'm intentional that I'm not describing this relational stance toward the world as indigenous per se, because I hold that it's very important to respect that the 350 million or so indigenous people like love, solidarity. I'm not indigenous myself in that way and will never be. For the 95% of humans who are not indigenous, is also very important to have a deep embodied ethic of relatedness and accountability to the rest of life, seen and unseen, that we don't feel guilty and convoluted and ashamed about. There's no need to justify earth devotion and a relational ethic by way of aligning with indigenous people per se. That ethic is present in many cultures and many times. And let us give acknowledgement in all the places where indigenous traditions and cultures have kept alive those understandings so that they can be reactivated in other places and lineages. So one thing about animism is it's not, we can have an intellectual discourse about it, but having an intellectual experience of the thing is very different than relating directly with the dead or with the spirit of the wind or the waters or whatever it is. So like any other aspect of life, you can study up all day long, and that's useful through reading about racism as a white person, but that doesn't mean you're going to have the lived experience of a person of color who is experiencing different kinds of harms. I thought I knew something about parenting because I was a therapist, and then I became a parent. And for example, so it's important that we have respect for the difference between an intellectual frame and actually stepping in and speaking to the spirits of the trees, for example, and having them respond and legitimizing that dialogue. Why does it matter, this thing? Why? Well, it seems a little, for some of you, I imagine it's like, yeah, it's familiar. I'm already living that, or sounds good, or that sounds a little esoteric. I imagine it lands anywhere on that spectrum. And what I want to say is it's not inconsequential. In the movement for climate change, let's say, it's important to keep in mind that there aren't any environmental problems. because there's no nature. There's no human nature split, even for the humans who view the world in that way and therefore act unconsciously, typically, to replicate that harm. The idea that there's nature or there's the environment is itself a colonialist, like, I don't think I should say mind fuck. Let's see, a problem, a really problematic way to frame it, because it is to suggest that somehow things can happen to the environment that aren't happening to us. And when we say there are environmental problems, climate change is a pressing environmental problem. We could get behind that probably. But it's a human behavior problem. It's a human generated problem. And human impact, human driven climate change is a function of human confusion about our place in the larger web of people, human and otherwise, and relationships. And so reorienting our place for those who have lost the way, and not all people have, reorienting our place in a way that overhauls systems as well. It's not just about shifting our attitude or curating the right post on Facebook. So we overhaul the systems in a way that reflects that we're accountable to these other kinds of people. As soon as the wind and the trees and the small fish that are being endangered because the temperature of the water is increasing, as soon as those are community members, they're relatives, they're people, they're family, they're kin, then it triggers a moral and ethical accountability to those others. And that means that those aspects of accountability should be reflected in laws and politics and culture and education and on all the levels. So it calls for a normalizing of the personhood of others in a very open way. And the rights of nature movement in Bolivia, parts of more indigenous Latin America, New Zealand, India, things like that are trying to bridge this gap. And it matters also on a very human-oriented level, because the environmental changes, the changes in the larger other than human neighborhoods that we depend on and are embedded in, are disproportionately affect people who have less money, and who are, because of histories of oppression, are more often Black, Indigenous people of color. And so I imagine if you signed up for this, you already get that, but it's important to underscore that climate change, human-driven climate change and the impacts of that, and dismantling and transforming legacies of racism are actually deeply intertwined. So it also matters because when people are lonely and unhappy and unfulfilled, we make worse choices. And when, psychologically speaking, we only see other living humans, and only certain other living humans, as sources of potential intimacy, the odds of us being really fulfilled and full of love and goodwill and generosity is lower, because we're less happy and more neurotic and more just like trying to survive. When we recognize it's possible to have a depth relationship with the earth where we're at, or with elemental fire, or with our own ancestors, or whatever, there's a lot of opportunities for relational intimacy, including conflict, which can be a catalyst for growth. There's more opportunities for that than if we have a more narrow, colonized view that says only certain living humans are okay to relate with. So psychologically, it's good to reclaim an animist ethic or framework that legitimizes the other kinds of people. It's not just intellectual, it also leads to a healthier relational world, better parenting, better education systems, all that. And the last thing I'll say on this very meta level is this stuff is learnable. If you have the idea that somehow indigenous people of the world are inherently more spiritual, it's like really good to unpackage that seemingly benevolent racist idea that suggests that culture is inherent rather than learned. If you raise someone who's, a full-blooded indigenous person in a very colonized setting, they're going to internalize that culture, even though there might be a spiritual tug from their ancestors. If you raise someone who's like super white person in a very culturally awesome setting, they're probably going to become a culturally awesome kind of person, most likely. So it means that we can learn a different framework and different values. Ritual, spirituality, religion, when it's functioning in a healthy way, it transmits core values through enacting relationship. If you look at ritual across the board, most kinds of rituals are about some kind of renewal or an acting of relationship with often with different powers that are other than human, or perhaps the ancestors that are human, but they're not here. So it's a good question in the chat. What is culturally awesome? Let me try to operationalize that a little bit. What I mean by that would be, we could say anti-racist, feminist, queer, celebrating, earth honoring, decolonized, economically just, good at sharing, multi-generational, pro-family, chilled out, loving, passionate culture. So something in that ballpark. Yeah. Yeah, and like demilitarized, all the things that we know are super harmful. Good. Let me say a thing about the ancestors in particular. So within this big framework of animism, which is really a shorthand way of saying we're just one kind of person. It's a decentering of humans, or a challenge to the human supremacy, which isn't actually working out that well on Earth. So within that, the ancestors, in the broadest sense, are like the trees and the wind and the sun and the weird land spirits and everything. Respect to that. That's both poetic and esoterically true. And I tend to use personally the word ancestors in English to more narrowly refer to the human dead, all those who were previously alive in human form and are not incarnate right now, but nonetheless dwell in the present and can be related with in the present. So think of human as a calabash with two halves, Igba, they say in Yoruba, calabash, and one is in a room, one's in Aye. One is in the seen and one is in the unseen realm. And so the other half of the calabash of our human community is not currently incarnate. And we could think of their world as a mirror of ours, or like a city divided by a river. And there's a lot of them who could come here, or we could talk to them. So there's traffic between as well. In a sense, they're also right here. There's not really two worlds, but functionally there also is. So in the more narrow sense, the ancestors, let's say there are different kinds of ancestors first. There are ancestors that of blood and of body. They're ancestors of family. When your family is chosen family, you're adopted, the people that do the work of raising you, or people you choose to make family with. There's ancestors of vocation, of spiritual lineage. I gave acknowledgement to some of them in the prayer, even though I'm clearly not ethnically Yoruba. And there are ancestors of land or of place. So there are lots of different era of culture, like cultural heroes and inspirations. So there are lots of different kinds of ancestors. And my angle, my bias on that is that it's good to include your ancestors of blood. You may not feel moved to expand your relational tending with the ancestors beyond them, but it is important to include them. And that has to do also with being culturally situated and accountable. And because in any given moment, including this moment, it's me and my people speaking to you and your people. So every moment, whether or not we bring it conscious, is a moment of potential cultural diplomacy. And yeah, that principle is one key to not doing further cultural harm. And if we can be skillful about it, we can actually enact good intergenerational diplomacy through one another. So lots of kinds of ancestors. Another distinction with the ancestors is that they are the ones who are relatively well and at peace in spirit, as opposed to the ghosts, the not yet ancestors. And we could get granular about this distinction between the ancestors and the ghosts. But in a general way, I'm saying that just dying does not make you an ancestor. It makes you not in a body anymore. Someone who's just an awful person during life, or really quite troubled, and dies, unless something substantial happens, which it could, they're probably going to be a disoriented, kind of awful, confused spirit within a few hours of the death of the body. And the things can change, and we'll talk about that, but the point is that just dying doesn't automatically make you wise and kind and loving. I've studied a lot of religious systems around the world and what they have to say about the ancestors, and I've never encountered a system that says that, ever. And except for maybe some, like, said with, you know, respect and respectful disagreement, maybe some New Age type philosophies, I guess. So the dead are people, and like living people, some of them are a hot mess and some of them are fantastic, and a lot of them are somewhere in between. And so if you're going to go from an intellectual curiosity about the ancestors, or ancestors as metaphor, into actually relating with them as people that exist in the present who are not you, one of the most important first things is to have discernment about who you're relating with. Just because you liked them while they were on earth, just because they've died, just because you have culturally things in common with them, just because you're related to them, none of those things inherently mean that they've actually arrived at the status of ancestor. Death is the beginning of a rite of passage that, if it goes well, folks become ancestors. That can happen quickly if people are really tapped in and taking care of stuff during their time on earth. Even so, if somebody dies, give them at least a week or two before you call on them too heavily. Even if they're super awake, like, let them have a minute to adjust. And but a lot of cultures give it about a year. Like, some stuff's going to happen. Let them be in a different status for a minute, and then at a certain point, they will be a seated ancestor you can then relate with. So that basic principle that ritual care is still relevant after the death of the body, and the ancestors are, the dead undergo a process that, if it goes well, results in the ancestralization, or them being seated or arrived as an ancestor. That's important, because otherwise, if you look, like anything, if you're going to go into a new kind of relationship, it does help to read the operating manual a little bit. And in this context, that means at least referencing what thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human culture around relating with the dead has to say about the topic. And one of the things, having studied it, is be discerning. The dead per se are not inherently helpful any more than the living are. So be discerning. That doesn't mean we don't show up for relationships. It just means we come with discernment. So what are the principles that, just tracking time. Yeah, okay, let me move through this quicker. We're going to get to embodied practice in 10 minutes or so. The 5 cross-cultural principles that you might consider if you are wanting to include the ancestors in part of your relational landscape. 1, consciousness or something continues after the death of the body. That's been implied in the way I've been talking about it. It's not only just one thing necessarily. A lot of cultures that I respect have the view that the soul is multiple. And so there can be rebirth. We can be born just once. We can be reborn along the bloodlines. We can be reborn in a different cultural environment. all those things can simultaneously be true. And time is weird and bendy, and you can be both reborn and an ancestor. And we're not that individual as we might like to think. And so, in that sense, we're talking about lineages that we are the face of that can have other faces. So, the point being, though, that something continues after the death of the body. If we try on that view, then to silence or omit the voices and concerns of the ancestors from how we do culture is erasure and problematic depersonifying and exclusion of an important demographic of family. 2, we can communicate with them. That's super normal, actually. It doesn't make you spiritual. It doesn't mean you need a website for it. It is actually really ordinary. If I said you can communicate with other living humans, you'd be like, yeah, I hope so. We're doing this webinar teaching thing. But it's the same with the dead. That can happen because they initiate it, or it can happen because you initiate it. It can happen in a way that actually isn't that healthy, because you're taking up a drinking habit and drinking for all the ghosts in your family. Or it can happen in a way that's super inspired and beautiful and just radiant. So the whole spectrum of communication is possible. It can happen consciously or not so much, but actual contact is possible. And just like with the living, misunderstanding is possible. Of course, that doesn't rule out that contact is possible. A third principle, as we already spoke about, is not all the dead are equally well. And this matters in the sense that I said that there are really just human behavior problems. There's not environmental problems. So what drives human behavior problems? From one perspective, is certainly the one I hold, including as a white American doctor of psychology, is that most of the mental and emotional turmoil that humans act out, including systemic harms or oppressive cultural things, they're ghost problems. They're intergenerational ghost problems that are the unmetabolized funk and difficulty of our ancestors. So not all the dead are equally well. The ones who are not well contribute to human turbulence. And the ones who are well and who are inspiring good culture, it's nice to pause and say, hey, thanks. And yes, thank you for the correction when I sometimes use the word Americans to refer to people from the United States. So yes, I'm a United States citizen. And another principle cross-culturally about relating between the living and the dead, and this is critically important, is that the dead change just like the living. If I said, look, living human beings can't change at all, cancel the movement, everything's frozen. Like who thinks that? I hope you don't think that. It's really cynical. Living humans might change slower than we would hope, but I'm saying that change can happen, and it happens actually quicker among the dead because they're not incarnate in the same way, and they're not having their identities relentlessly reinforced by culture and news and their nervous system and all that. So the dead can actually shift from a state of relative suffering and turbulence into a better state. That's good news. It also implies that they can culturally change. So if your ancestors are uniquely free from any harm, this may not apply to you, but most people's ancestors have enacted some type of difficulty on other humans during their life at some point. And I see it in the United States that sometimes people will have a view of, I see it especially, but not only, but especially with younger white people who are super well-meaning in movement culture and change work, will have a view of their own ancestors as like, my ancestors are terrible, they were slave owners, they did harms, and have this deep cultural shame. That's an opening. That, I'm not saying it's bad to be ashamed of that. It's a shame-worthy kind of thing. And the reality is that who those people were during their time on Earth has changed in the last 200 or however many years. And so it's not safe to assume that the dead are just frozen in state. That's not how relationship works. And the ones who enacted harm while on Earth can actually culturally change as well and become excellent allies in the present for the necessary justice work on Earth. And we want that ourselves. We want a world where we can make a mistake and be like, yeah, that was dumb. Let me make repairs. Let me not do that anymore, and let me make correction. So it calls for holding a space in our heart and in our awareness for our ancestors who did harm to change. And a final principle is that the degree of impact between the living and the dead is really substantial. It's not minor, it's not inconsequential. It's like saying the degree of impact between the mycelium and the mushroom is really substantial. The degree of impact between the larger system that we're the face of and our face is substantial. That we are structurally inseparably informed by and an extension of our ancestral lineages. It's not the only thing we're made of, but we don't get to opt out of influence. Those who think what I'm saying is really strange or antithetical to their views from this perspective are nonetheless informed and impacted by their own ancestral legacies. So we can reject that or not. It's just a structural thing. The advantage of bringing it conscious is that we can then work with it in some way and participate more consciously. So to recap, folks are asking in the chat, I did this 5 principles thing. Something continues after death. We can communicate with the ancestors and vice versa. It's number 2. Number 3, not all the dead are equally well. So they mirror the living in that way. They can change. They're not frozen in state any more than we're not. And finally, the degree of impact between the living and the dead is really substantial and therefore worth engaging with and considering in some way. Okay. Soon here, I want to glance to see if anyone has a question about any of that. I know it's a little theoretical, but I'm trying to efficiently give a little bit of a framework for things, because we're going to head in a moment into a light practice of just acknowledging the bigger field of ancestors that we're connected to. I can expand on the last point of impact from the dead. We inherit ancestral blessings. A lot of the people who are really rocking their life and being ethical and loving and useful people are unconsciously playing out ancestral blessings that they've inherited. A lot of the gifts that we bring to the world are ancestrally inherited gifts. I don't think the ancestors cared that much that we give credit or not, so long as we're actually living those gifts. And a lot of the troubles that we are enacting are ancestrally generated troubles as well. And, you know, I've been in dialogue, I teach this stuff, so people sometimes ask, how do you discern what's personal and what's cultural? And my sense is start with the view that everything is cultural. And so notice how, you know, racism and sexism and capitalism and all the different cultural patterns, and troubling and helpful, live within you, and then see what's left. Like a lot of the ways that we suffer or thrive have to do with the cultural environment, human and otherwise, that we're embedded in, because culture isn't limited to just humans. So yeah, the impact is big in a kind of systemic cultural way, and it's also strong on a very personal level, that your ancestors can step in and save your life and be like, don't go here, or you need to leave the house now, something's going to happen, go. If we're tuned in, like, it can be life or death kind of stuff. So good.
There was one more question in the
yeah, I see it from Alexander. I'll take the person off mute. Go ahead. I think it's Alexander. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you could speak to the practice or exercise of discernment.
Yeah, it's a good question. It, in the way of approaching the work that I have developed based on principles, none of which are unique to me, but what I teach, the first step of that is a assessment of one's ancestral lineages, and being curious, what kind of condition are they in the present? This forum is not a forum to get into actually doing that practice in an involved way, but what I would say is that it is possible to assess from your own instincts and curiosity and the other perhaps spirits or powers that support you, what kind of condition any given ancestral lineage or individual ancestor is currently in spirit. Usually that is something that is actually quite knowable, especially, or perceivable, especially when it has to do with your own ancestors. Like if I'm like, Alexandra, tell me about my great grandfather. That might be more of a stretch, but I'm like, if I ask you, tune in, tell me if your father's father is deeply at peace or not. You probably know. Like, you might have ideas about him, be like, well, I heard a lot of stories about him, all this and that. And there's you got to set the stories aside and actually intuitively look. You might look and be like, oh, he is. How nice. Nice to notice him. So we have a ability to perceive intuitively if we set up a condition that's safe and includes asking the right questions. So that's the way I teach it, is people have the ability to know. I don't step in and say, hey, let me tell you what's going on with your people. Yeah, cool. Thanks. I see good questions in the chat. I'm going to actually ask Marie, who's helping me, to make note of those because they're important. And I want to get to the embodied practice, and hopefully there'll be time for the questions as well. I'm not going to preface it a lot. You have choice, of course, with all of it if there's anything you don't want to do, but I'll talk you through a process of just noticing what's awesome about your own people and maybe inviting a blessing from them. I'll say a last thing before we do that practice, which is that everybody has ancestors who are wise and kind and loving and on the level. Even if it's the case that your recent ones, the ones who are remembered by name and face and action, may not necessarily be at that really vibrant state. Some of them might be, some of them might not be. Might be that all of them are. It could be that none of them are. All those things are possible. We're not going to get into those more focused kinds of discernment things right now. But we're going to generally invite those who are awesome among your people to step forward, and those who are still working it out to take just one step away from your immediate space. And in that, it means, when I say your ancestors, the vast majority of them are ones who lived before remembered names, before the last couple hundred years. So please see it as a much bigger landscape of lineages. Okay. We'll take 10, 15 minutes at the most. I'll talk you through it. Start just by rooting your awareness, maybe with your breath, into your hips and feet and into your space. There's no need to reach outside yourself in the practice. So inhabit your space. And notice at least one force or spirit or power that you already know and trust with you, resourcing you. And ask that you be with that one in a protected space so that only supportive, kind, helpful, anything is welcome around you at this time. And outside this sphere of your protected, embodied space, just notice what already is. You're not changing anything. You're not trying to do anything. Notice that there are many, many, many different branching lineages that you're connected to through your ancestors of blood and body. Blood and bone ancestors. A nod of respect to the others. And in just this moment, we're going to notice ancestors of body. And you're not trying to connect with them. You're just noticing how quickly there are 4, 16, 64, 254 generations, etc. So see this collective of ancestors who are your people in all their complexity. And try on the perspective here that some among those ancestors in the present, today, right now, some of them are perhaps still in process. And they're still, they're still working stuff out in some way, let's say. And that others among them are deeply, deeply at peace. And there's a connection to love and wisdom and to one another and to the land and to big, beautiful powers that are hold up life. So just notice without any judgment that there's a spectrum among them of how vibrant some are and some are less so. And without any judgment at all to the ones who are still in process, I invite you to call nearer to your circle, not within your circle, but just asking that those who are really rooted in wisdom and love and awareness draw closer around you. And that you don't need to know their names. You're not trying to connect with them right now. And that those who are still in need in any way, blessings to them. You're just asking that they take one step back is all from your personal space. So you're letting those who are really vibrant and really loving and resourced circle around your space. And allow that reorganization to happen for a minute. And if it feels right to you, trust your sense. You might approach the edge of your circle of protection and, in whatever way, just extend a greeting and acknowledgement to these vibrant, wise, loving people who are your people. And again, trusting your sense about what's best for you. If it feels comfortable and within reach, you might allow yourself to receive a blessing from them, to be humble, to be the child of these elders, and to just invite them to bless your life. And we'll take another minute or two to just sit in presence with them, listening, not pushing any agenda, but just being present with them. And to, as a final act here in this practice, you might sit with these wise and kind ones among your people and hold a prayer with them for all those who are also your people, who are perhaps still in need or perhaps suffering in some way or confused. You're not calling them closer, but you, at the center of this circle of vitality with the ancestors are praying with the ancestors that those who are still having needs be well met by the wise and loving ones. They're not abandoned in any way. May they receive the care they need. So hold a prayer for them without calling them closer. So allowing that to just reverberate, knowing that there's nothing further you necessarily need to do about it in this moment. We'll shift attention back to a more interactive space here. If anyone has a question or something that feels important to express, it's fine to raise your hand or to ask that throughout. I know that there were a few other questions that came through. I do want to speak a bit more in our time to the connection between ancestors, relating with the ancestors and cultural change. And so, yeah, so that's where I'm headed, but I know we're kind of pivoting from big cultural stuff to direct what's up, dead people. And so I want to acknowledge the different zones we're moving in here. Okay. Ancestors and cultural change. Let me highlight a few things. Then we'll have a little bit of dialogue and then do another dropped in practice. And we'll see where we're at time-wise there. Look, I'm just who I am. I think it's important to not posture to be some expert, so to speak, in how culture changes, but I feel able, because of my work and my experience with ritual, to bring some perspective on how things can change when we bring in the ancestors to the equation and when we work with the spirits as well. One thing that feels true is it's important to not attempt to shift things like human-driven climate change, systemic racism, poverty, different kinds of really fatally problematic ways of being, from the stance that those problems don't also live within us, that we're not also capable of that. For me, a way I think of this is having a world-shaped heart. And so if the world is also reflected in this body, it means the bliss and goodness in the world also has an inner reflection, as well as the horror and the violence and the pettiness and the ignorance. And that's a real buzzkill for the righteousness. Because if you are coming from a primarily like down with those bad other people stance, then it's creating a kind of separation that actually is part of the problem. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be fierce and committed and all the way in about change work. And I'm not saying exactly how that needs to look. It's not my place to do that. But what I'm saying is it's possible to be passionate and in one's warriorship and potency while not doing this thing that we depersonify or negate the existence of others, or say you are fundamentally evil or bad or outside the system. Like we're all related except you. That's not how we get there. And so the ethic is that we're fundamentally part of the same family, and at any given moment, any given person or system can be out of balance. I say that because as a United States citizen, the tendency is strong here now on these occupied lands to come with a unconsciously puritanical and colonialist rigidity in how we talk about cultural change work, and to suggest that the way that it's talked about here should be the way that's talked about in other places, and that there is one correct, true way to do things. And I'm saying that righteousness and that rigidity is itself a colonialist or a symptom of cultural wounding. It's a developmental stuckness. And it says, well, instead of I'm the best, my particular subgroup is the best, or my particular way of framing things is the best. It's in psychological jargon, it's a displacement of primary narcissism onto your group or onto your ideology and onto your, clever way of framing things that you figured out. So the antidote to that is to develop an ethic of recognizing and celebrating difference and diversity of view, diversity of form, diversity of ancestry, of lineage, whatever. And if you can't recognize the rigidity and the way it lives in yourself, it's probably because you're acting from it. And I'm saying that this is a innate human hazard, and it can work at cross purposes to the kind of cultural transformation we need. This connects to the question that came in about destiny, and it's my takeaway from the ways that I have been able to sit with more intact cultures, that a common feature is of, we could say indigenous systems, but indigenous is a tricky word, especially in continental Africa. Like Yoruba people aren't legally indigenous, but explain that to Yoruba people and the conversation is going to get strange. And so the view among a lot of earth honoring peoples is that humans are different and unique, and we have different destinies. And there's not one way that everybody ought to be. And it's very, very tempting and almost automatic to take your particular destiny and your settings and your style and to mistake that for the way that that the world ought to be. And that particular developmental youngness is something that is good to bring attention to and try to reel in a little bit. It gets associated, understandably, with whiteness as a cultural trait in North America and beyond. But speaking from my experience here, there's a kind of let me just explain it to you, or with patriarchy, things like that. But it's a deeply psychological thing, and it has this whiff of like supremacy attitude. So notice it, interrupt it. The ancestors are good at that because they're rowdy and they have lots of different voices and perspectives that can be accessed. Another thing I want to say about science in this moment, it's a moment where, as someone who actually love good science and a bit of a naturalist and amateur naturalist, and I'm also connected to some spiritual circles that at times are still just finding their footing with cultural literacy. And it's been really a bummer to me to see how quickly people identified with spirituality will disavow and reject good science in this moment. And maybe that's mostly happening in North America. So respect if it doesn't apply to where you're at. But there's no inherent tension with good science and relating with the spirits and the dead and the deities. In Yoruba culture, one of the Orisha, the goddesses of weather, is Oya Yansan, is a very catalytic, transformative goddess, if you will, of big change and storm, and also river goddess, and many things. But she'd said to me some years ago, it was a strange communication. It basically that the ghosts are driving climate change. I'm like, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense to me. And I can frame it as, well, human behavior is driving climate change for the most part. There's a small part that's just background climate change, but almost all of it's human behavior. And so the ghosts drive human behavior, therefore the ghosts are driving climate change. She's like, yeah, also that. But there's a way in which what was being conveyed, and I haven't explored it so much further, is that the actual failure to ancestralize, or the way that the dead are hanging around. So let's say I think there's a few 100 million people on Earth that die every year. I forget the numbers, but let's say that, I'm going to be generous, let's say that half of them within the year are really well-seated ancestors. Depends on where you're at culturally. That's a lot of new ghosts every year in any case. And so there's a way in which it functions as a kind of subtle, what was being conveyed is like air pollution almost, like like a kind of interference in the larger field here. And in that way, she's saying humans, like, you need to clean up trash in the environment or clean up the oceans. You want to clean up the atmosphere, handle your extended psychic spiritual footprint by ancestralizing your dead. I'm like, whoa, that's not a conclusion I would have come to on my own. And it is possible. I share that as an example to say that for one, it highlights our tendency to be like, oh no, but there's humans and there's nature. They're two different things. We're not the environment. We're just humans. Like, well, I can't speak without breathing. This is also the sound of the atmosphere. And so we are not separate. And I love good climate science. I am a scientist at heart, and it's totally compatible to have ancient deities and forces articulated by Yoruba people speak to humans who even are not Yoruba about the dead and the role of the dead in shaping climate. That's totally compatible with being a scientist. The idea that you have to choose spiritual stuff or science, totally false split. Don't internalize it, please. Same with the pandemic. OMG, like, please love on the virologists and epidemiologists and the people who know about the viruses and listen to them. I won't be preachy about it, but like, we can be passionate, critical thinking people and defer to expertise. Okay. Feel free to jump in with questions here. I know, I don't know, it's fine also, but there's something still just like inevitably awkward for me about talking at you all, but we'll make some space for dialogue shortly. A few other things that feel really essential here is folks who are steeped in change work with the systems, with movement work, activism work for social and earth justice, all of it. Fantastic. And if you're not already doing it, I would suggest that it's good for you to also drop in with the ancestors, to actually talk to the rivers where you're at, to do more ritual, to let it be a part of your life in a catalytic way. if it's not already. And the folks who are already doing a bunch of ritual and spiritual stuff, it's good to make sure you're being tangible and grounded and actually working for systemic change. Those two camps can tend to be a little bit separated or unnecessarily polarized. I'm generalizing, right? But if you notice, if your comfort zone is in one or the other, and I am suggesting that holding both is really a good stance. I think of people like Wangari Maathai as someone who comes to mind as she's past now, a Nobel Prize winner in Kenya in the Green Belt movement. And listening to her speak at times, my feeling is like, wow, this person is like a pillar of spiritual like potency and ancestral wisdom. And she might be talking about policy and public policy and environmental issues or whatever, but there's a integrated, the connection with the spirits is integrated and turning toward the world. And so that is a good look, and the ancestors and the powers will cause your change work to be even more effective because they want it. Oh my God. Like the ancestors love children, among other things. And yeah, the name is Wangari Maathai. Yeah, thanks, whoever put it there. Two other things, and then we'll be in conversation for a minute. I know I kind of said it already, but there's no environmental problems. There's human behavior problems that get concretized into systems. And then we have the systemic problems, which are so important to keep as the emphasis, because everyone could wake up and be suddenly culturally woke or whatever that means. And now we have all these systems that will continue today and tomorrow to replicate the harm. So the systems need the focus. Ibram Kendi's work is really instructional in this way. He's a excellent American scholar of racist ideas and history here. The thing about the systems that needs to shift and that needs to be included in the dialogue, in my bias, is this piece around recognizing the personhood of the other than humans. If we say legitimately, importantly, where are the voices of the women? Where are the voices of the queer people? Where are the voices of the people of color, indigenous people, Black people, etc.? Where are the voices of the people that don't have a lot of money? Where are the voices of the people outside the United States, etc.? I want it to be a habit to say, well, where are the voices of the mountains? Where are the voices of the dead? Where are the voices of the plants here? Have we actually sought to include the voice of the local waters and the water spirits? I would love to see, and I'm not saying it doesn't already exist, so it does, and especially, but not only, in a lot of more explicitly indigenous organizing spaces. But I would love to see that ethic of relatedness and no longer participating in erasure of the other than humans become normalized in how we're going about change work, and eventually to be normalized in how we run for public office. Imagine the next president of the United States, let's say, not only being a person of color or a queer person or someone who's has two husbands or whatever, but someone who is also understands explicitly and is running on a platform that they would be the political president in service to the waters of this nation and the other than humans. They probably wouldn't get elected, but bless them. Like that's where we're headed. It needs to be really normal. When we project that kind of view onto indigenous people only, it's a racist fetishizing of indigenous culture that disowns your own ancestral ethics of being a good earth person. So don't do that. Nobody wants to be like that. The last thing is grieving is super important. I know it hasn't been a big focus of what we're doing here, but it's really great practice to just lay on the earth and cry your face off and be like, I'm so, so sorry for how we are. It really super hurts my heart and my life. And I want to know how to do better and be part of doing better. And sometimes there's not a big single thing to do, so to speak, but just feel the messy enormity of it. And to recognize that all the cultural harms with the other humans that are playing out, there's like this move where we're like, oh, you mean we're actually part of this bigger web? That's fantastic. Oh, wait, there's a whole nother layer of all these other cultural harms that are in the culture between the humans and the other than humans who also have culture. And so in a sense, the amount of grief and accountability and all of it is bigger once we hold an animist frame. And that's beautiful and blissful and totally sorrowful. There's at least a few species of life that have gone extinct during the call. I think it's about 50 a day. That's from human behavior. I think it's good to talk about the climate change. And for me, human-driven extinction is as foreground. It's not as noticeable. It's just a silent disappearance of diversity. So the good thing about the grieving is that there are many, many other beings who can help hold us in that. And when we're held by the powers, then we can grieve more potently and deeply. And that's part of just staying whole through the times. Yeah. Now I see from the Ecuatoriana, it's good about someone's saying from Ecuador that it's incorporated in the Constitution about the rights of nature. Ecuador has been exemplary, at least in policy. I don't know how much it's enacted about affirming the personhood of the other than humans. Oh, just taking a breath. That's a lot of terrain for an hour and a half. And we want to get to a practice here. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to hang out after the hour and a half completes and be in Q&A mode. And we're going to use the 10, 15 minutes remaining for the 90 minutes for an embodied practice because it feels important to bring it there. So let's offset all the talky energy with dropping in with the people. Process-wise, before we do it, is important when we're talking about the others in the same way that if you're a dude, if you're a white person, if you're whatever, unless you're presenting, in which case is different, you don't want to hog all the space and you want to drop back and let others have a voice and be mindful of impact. You don't really want to just talk about the ancestors or talk about the others only. It's important to make a space for them to actually speak and be present. So that's part of why we make sure to weave in the practices. Okay, I'll talk you through it. And anything I invite you to explore with them, of course, just trust your instinct on whether or not it's good for you. Shift your attention to the dropped in belly and hips and feet kind of place again, just to be in your own space fully. And notice one or more powers that you already feel close and safe with, present with you. Notice that you're in a protected space and resourced and feeling all right to listen in a little. Bring your awareness back again to the ancestors you're connected to in the larger web through your body, blood, and bones, and reaffirm that those closest to you in this moment are those who are deeply wise and kind and already quite healed. So affirm that with a nod of respect to those who are one orbital out or a little bit beyond the well ones. And make sure you're allowing for just basic attunement, shared space, recognizing them as they exist in the present. Just being able to sit in their presence and their company in this moment without needing to reach for stories or details or anything. And take a moment to reaffirm the prayer from the last drop in, the intent that those among your people who are still in need and still perhaps having a hard time, that these wise and kind ancestors may bring healing to those ones, that you're asking those among your people who are in a position to do so, to extend care and love and healing to those others among your people who are still in need. And while that's playing out, knowing that they're the ones enacting that help, shift into a place of listening with any among your wise and kind and well ancestors who want to share with you any perspective on the pandemic, on climate change, on the turmoil in the United States, if you're here, just the moment that we're living in. Take a moment to listen to what they want you to hear or know about that. Be curious if there's anything they want you to do or to not do to be in your own particular lane with destiny, in your own potential and in your own role, in your own seat. Any perspective they want to add about that, knowing that you have choice about whether or not you do those things. Staying with that, if it's where the focus needs to be, I'm going to invite you, if you can see it, to try to imagine, and for some it might be more easy than others. Try to imagine that and envision, it's a kind of prayer, not just an imagining, that any among your people who are still working it out, that you hold the vision of them not only arriving at a state of vibrancy and peace, but also of being culturally really attuned to what's needed. So I'm asking you to picture your ancestors embodying their own very authentic to them, liberatory, decolonizing, anti-racist, feminist, queer, awesome, beautiful ethic, however that is authentic for them. Just envision it. Hold that prayer open for them. Take just another few minutes, and one invitation here is to notice. Maybe it's a question you bring to them, maybe it's just a noticing. How would you move in the world any differently if this support and connectivity was your regular posture, your default way of moving to be ancestrally resourced? Of course, it's available, but I'm inviting you in this moment to try it on. To try it on to picture your life being informed by moment to moment connectivity with them. And the very final invitation, this may be a stretch. See if you can try on, with their support, a vision of the good outcome. There's a lot of forces that are troubling and entrenched. And I'm asking you with your people to just, even if it's only for a few moments, try on the vision of the next year, 5 years, 20 years, of things actually trending in a really, really wholesome direction on Earth. So we give thanks for the opportunity to share in this moment. We ask that the spirits extend protection and resilience and fortitude to all those who are most directly working for transformation of hazardous systems. We ask that there be blessing for Bayo and Owolabi and Aaron and Marie and everybody, Karen, everybody connected with this event. And we ask that you help each of us and those listening later to become increasingly clear about our very specific responsibilities and destiny, and to fulfill those responsibilities boldly, generously, creatively here in service to life and to love, and keep leaning in with big hearts and humility. Take a moment and give thanks for your people, knowing that, of course, they're always with you, but maybe you're shifting attention now. Make sure you are in a clear place with your own energy. If they showed you anything you need to remember, make a note of it so you actually remember it. Yeah.